Imagine stepping through the towering gates of a medieval castle, expecting the grandeur of stone halls and the elegance of noble life, only to be hit with a stench so powerful it makes your eyes water and your stomach churn. The truth is, if you could travel back in time, you'd find that the most luxurious castles of Europe smelled far worse than the filthiest city sewers. Forget the fairy tales. These fortresses were chambers of rot, disease, and decay, where the air itself could make you sick. The lords and ladies who lived there may have worn silks and jewels, but they waded through filth every day, and the horrors of their daily lives are almost beyond belief. The first thing to strike any visitor would be the overwhelming odor of human waste. Medieval castles were built for defense, not comfort, and sanitation was an afterthought at best. Most castles had primitive toilets, called garderobes, simple holes in the wall that dropped waste down into cesspits, or worse, straight onto the ground below. In theory, the wind would carry the smell away, but in reality, the stench rose up the walls, seeping back into the living quarters. During sieges, when hundreds of people crowded inside for weeks, the garderobes overflowed and the floors became slick with filth. Servants tried to clean, but there was only so much they could do. The result was a constant nauseating cloud of stink that clung to every stone. But human waste was only the beginning. Castles were bustling communities, home not just to nobles, but to soldiers, servants, cooks, and animals. Horses, dogs, and livestock wandered the courtyards, leaving droppings everywhere. Food scraps, bones, and spoiled meat were tossed out windows or into corners where they rotted and attracted swarms of rats and flies. The kitchens, often located in damp, windowless rooms, were breeding grounds for mold and bacteria. The smell of rancid fat and burnt meat mixed with the reek of unwashed bodies and animal dung, creating a miasma that never truly faded. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. Bathing was rare, especially in winter when cold water could mean illness or death. Most people washed only their hands and faces, if at all. Clothes were worn for weeks or months without washing, and beds were infested with lice and fleas. The wealthy might own a perfumed pomander or a sprig of herbs to hold under their nose, but these did little to mask the overwhelming odors. Even the great halls, where banquets and ceremonies took place, were thick with the smells of sweat-spilled ale and the greasy smoke from hundreds of tallow candles. Disease thrived in this environment. The lack of sanitation meant that outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and plague were common. Rats and mice carried fleas that spread deadly illnesses, and the water supply was often contaminated with waste. Wells were dug dangerously close to cesspits, and rain would wash filth into the drinking water. The result was a cycle of sickness and death that claimed lives at every level of society. The castles may have been fortresses against invaders, but they were powerless against the invisible armies of bacteria and vermin that ruled within. The most chilling part is how normal it all was. The people who lived in these castles grew up surrounded by filth and learned to accept the smell as part of daily life. Children played in the courtyards, dodging piles of manure and garbage. Servants swept the floors, but the dirt always returned. Even the nobles, with all their wealth and power, could not escape the stench. The perfumes and incense they used were a desperate attempt to cover up a reality that no one could truly ignore. The horrors of castle life went far beyond the nose. The smell was only the first warning. What it hinted at was a world where filth and disease lurked in every shadow, and even the most powerful lords were prisoners of their own refuse. The garderobes, those infamous medieval toilets, were not just foul, but dangerous. Cesspits beneath the castle walls filled up quickly, especially during long winters or sieges. When the pits overflowed, waste seeped into the foundations, rotting the very stones and attracting armies of insects. In some castles, desperate servants had to climb into these pits to shovel out the filth by hand, risking suffocation from the toxic fumes or drowning in the sludge. There are stories of workers who vanished into the muck, their bodies never recovered, their screams muffled by layers of human waste. The problem was made worse by the castle's design. Thick stone walls trapped heat and moisture, turning the air inside into a breeding ground for mold and mildew. The dampness crept into every room, blackening the walls and filling the halls with a sour, earthy stench. In winter, fires burned constantly, but the smoke had nowhere to go. Chimneys were a luxury, so most rooms filled with choking fumes, mixing with the ever-present smell of rot. The combination of smoke mold and filth made the air heavy and hard to breathe, especially for children and the elderly. In the kitchens, the situation was even more dire. Food was stored in cellars that were cool, but also damp and dark, perfect for the growth of bacteria and fungi. Meat spoiled quickly, and even salted or smoked foods could turn rancid. Bread was often infested with weevils, and cheese crawled with maggots. Milk soured in the heat, and barrels of ale grew thick with mold. Cooks did what they could to disguise the taste and smell of spoiled food. Heavy spices, onions, and garlic were used in abundance not for flavor, but to cover up decay. But nothing could truly hide the rot, and food poisoning was a constant threat. Even water, the most basic necessity, was rarely clean. Rainwater was collected in cisterns, but birds and animals often fell in and drowned their bodies, decomposing unseen. Wells, as mentioned, were often contaminated by nearby cesspits. The result was a constant risk of cholera, dysentery, and other deadly diseases. People learned to drink ale or weak beer instead of water, but even these could be tainted. The smell of sour ale and spoiled wine mingled with the odors of sweat and decay, creating a haze that hung over every meal. The castle's inhabitants tried to fight back against the stench, but their efforts were mostly in vain. Rushes or straw were spread on the floors to soak up spills and waste, but these quickly became filthy and had to be replaced. The old rushes, crawling with insects and soaked in urine, were simply thrown out the windows or into the moat. The moat itself, once a line of defense, became a stagnant pool of sewage and garbage, breeding mosquitoes and adding yet another layer to the castle's reek. Animals were everywhere. Dogs, cats, chickens, pigs, and even goats roamed freely through the halls and courtyards. Their droppings mixed with the human waste, and their bodies, when they died, were sometimes left to rot until someone could be spared to drag them away. Fleas and lice infested both animals and people, spreading disease and adding to the misery. The constant scratching and biting was a daily torment, and outbreaks of skin diseases like scabies and ringworm were common. The noble residents of the castle were not immune to these horrors. Their fine clothes and perfumes could not protect them from lice or the stench of decay. Bathing was rare and often seen as dangerous. Many believed that water could carry disease into the body through the skin. Instead, people relied on linen undergarments to absorb sweat and dirt, changing them when possible, but rarely washing them. The result was a population that stank to high heaven, their bodies covered in layers of grime, their hair crawling with vermin. The great feasts and celebrations that filled the castle halls were spectacles of excess and filth. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and pies, but scraps and bones were tossed to the floor, where dogs and rats fought for the leftovers. Drunken guests relieved themselves in corners or behind tapestries, adding to the already overwhelming smell. After the revelry, servants swept the debris into piles and dumped it outside, but the stains and smells lingered for days. The worst of it all was that the people who lived in these castles had no idea how dangerous their world truly was. They believed the foul air was simply a fact of life, not realizing that it carried invisible killers, bacteria, viruses, and parasites that claimed countless lives. The Black Death swept through castles as easily as it did through peasant villages, and outbreaks of typhoid and dysentery were regular occurrences. The castles may have been strongholds against human enemies, but they were helpless against the relentless assault of filth and disease. The nightmare of medieval castle life was not just a matter of discomfort, it was a daily battle for survival against an environment so toxic that even the strongest could be brought low. The stench that filled every corridor was a warning of deeper dangers. Disease was the true master of the castle, striking down lords and peasants, alike with terrifying speed. Epidemics swept through the stone walls, carried by fleas, lice, and the very air itself. Typhus, dysentery, and plague found easy victims among people weakened by malnutrition and filth. The dead were sometimes so numerous that burial became impossible. Bodies were left in cellars or hastily dumped in the moat, their decay adding to the already overpowering smell. The castle's defenses, so effective against human enemies, became traps during outbreaks. Gates were closed and no one could leave. The sick and dying were crowded into small rooms, their cries echoing through the halls. Physicians lacking any real understanding of infection prescribed useless remedies, bleeding, burning herbs, or forcing the sick to inhale foul-smelling concoctions in the hope that bad air could be driven out by something even worse. The result was a cycle of suffering and death, with survivors left permanently scarred both in body and mind. Even daily routines were haunted by the castle's filth. Servants woke before dawn to scrape waste from the garderobes, sweep the rushes, and haul buckets of dirty water up and down endless stairs. Their hands were raw and cracked, their lungs filled with dust and mold. Children grew up surrounded by death and decay, their games played in the shadows of disease. The noble children fared little better, their privileged lives marked by the same lice, the same foul air, and the same constant threat of illness. The architecture itself became a silent accomplice to the misery. Narrow staircases and hidden passages trapped air and odors, making escape from the stench impossible. Secret rooms and dungeons once used for intrigue and imprisonment became breeding grounds for rats and insects. The castle's very stones absorbed the filth, holding on to the smell for generations. Even after a castle was abandoned, visitors centuries later have reported a lingering mustiness, a ghostly reminder of the suffering that once filled those halls. The psychological toll was immense. Chronic illness, constant discomfort, and the omnipresent threat of death wore down even the most resilient. Religion offered little comfort. Priests preached that suffering was the will of God, and that the filth of the world was a test of faith. Some sought solace in superstition, hanging herbs and charms to ward off evil spirits, but nothing could truly protect them from the invisible dangers that filled the air. Yet the myth of the romantic medieval castle persists. Tourists marvel at the soaring towers and grand halls, rarely imagining the realities of life within. The truth is that these castle symbols of power and prestige were also monuments to human endurance in the face of relentless squalor. Every banquet, every battle, every whispered intrigue took place against a backdrop of filth and decay. The people who lived and died within these walls were not just victims of their enemies, but of the very environment they called home. The legacy of medieval castles is not just one of chivalry, and conquest, but of survival against overwhelming odds. The stones that witnessed centuries of history also absorbed the misery of countless lives, their silent testimony preserved in the lingering stench that no amount of incense or perfume could ever truly erase. The next time you stand in the shadow of a castle's walls, remember beneath the grandeur lies a history far darker and more disturbing than any fairy tale.